today we're going to continue talking about World War One. We're going to focus on the Western Front and the Eastern Front, what that looked like. Let me show you the map here that we started with. So, as you'll remember from the other day in group time, this yellow portion here, those are the Central Powers. The green portions around are going to be the Allies, okay? Now, the Western Front is going to be this red line right here. The Eastern Front is going to be this line right here, okay? So, as you can see, a lot of battles were fought, especially along the Western Front right here. These are little battles there. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, all right? All right, so ever since the 1890s, Germany had feared that it would face a war on two sides, against Russia in the east and France in the west. Germany knew that it would be hard to win a two-sided attack against its enemies because they're right in the middle. So they devised a plan to knock France out quickly out of the war before turning to fight Russia. Now, Germany intended to invade Belgium to get to France and capture Paris. This attack on France was called the Schlieffen Plan and was put into action on August 1914, the year the war started. It required German troops to go around the north and west of Paris to cut the city off. However, the German commander decided to go to the east of Paris. And what this did was this left the German army exposed in the north. On September 5th of that year, 1914, the British and French armies attacked, pushing the German troops back. Each side then tried to defeat the other by heading further and further north in what became known as the Race to the Sea. By December 1914, it became clear that neither side could break through the other's defenses. And this created what we call the Western Front. Both had dug long lines of trenches. Now, we're going to talk about trenches in a second, but those are channels dug in the earth. Both had dug long lines of trenches from the Belgian coast in the north to the Swiss border in the south. This area of fighting was known as the Western Front. Okay? Now, the important thing to know about the Western Front, it is when trenches started to be built, and I will talk about that right now. So essentially what you would have is you would have, say you would have one side here and one side here. Well, there would be trenches dug right here on one side. On the other side, so it would be another set of trenches here. And then in the middle, you would have an area known as no man's land, which we'll talk about that here in a second. But there are two sides. Each one of them have trenches that they've dug, and they have this area in the middle that they're fighting, okay? So the bottom of the trench was dug deep enough so that soldiers could walk along it without being exposed to enemy fire. Steps enabled soldiers to see over no man's land, which is what we call it, and fire on the enemy, okay? The land between the trenches was a sea of mud blasted by artillery shells. The bodies of dead soldiers often lay here for days because it was too dangerous to retrieve them. And oftentimes what you would have is one side's trenches would then have barbed wire between itself and no man's land. So you have this trench dug into the earth here. You'd have a big old set of barbed wire, and then you'd have no man's land where if you go in there, you're probably going to be killed. And then you would have some more barbed wire here, and you'd have the trench of the other side. So that's essentially what it looked like there. Okay, let's talk about how these trenches were made. At the start of World War I in 1914, both sides on the Western Front expected to fight fast-moving battles over large areas. However, things came to a standstill because the two sides were evenly matched. Powerful and long-range weapons, such as cannons and quick-fire machine guns, made it dangerous for soldiers to fight in unprotected open ground. The only way to survive such weapons was to dig defensive trenches. At the start of the war, neither side had much experience in digging trenches, and early ones did not provide much cover. But soldiers soon learned from their mistakes and built deeper, long-lasting trenches that they could best see and fire at the enemy while remaining hidden. The British and French preferred to capture as much ground as possible before digging their trenches. Let's talk about trench warfare, okay? Obviously, the style of fighting has changed for all of these countries, and so it's something brand new. And let's talk about how they would fight in these trenches. Most of the action on the Western Front took place between soldiers in their trenches, rather than in the open ground or no man's land between the two opposing lines of trenches. Many lives were lost in the first months of the war as huge armies charged toward deadly machine guns on the other side. When it became clear that neither side could break through the other's defenses, they dug long lines of trenches, and trench warfare became the new method of fighting. From their trenches, both armies took every opportunity to shoot at anyone who was foolish or unlucky enough to be visible on the other side. Even soldiers trying to rescue their wounded men from no man's land were considered fair targets. Each side also sent out nighttime raiding parties to try and capture enemy trenches. This nonstop shooting and sniping kept every soldier on full alert and meant that a permanent lookout had to be kept on enemy lines, with guns always in position in case of a sudden attack. All right, let's talk about what life was like in the trenches, okay? Because a lot of these soldiers, they lived there. So, much different life than being on top of ground. So, life in the trenches was obviously very difficult. They were infested with rats year-round. And in the winter, the trenches filled with mud and ice. The soldiers were often cold and wet, hungry and exhausted, and to make matters worse, they knew they could be attacked at any moment. Sunrise and sunset were the most likely time for an enemy attack. So at those times, soldiers manned the fire bays, which were the sections where troops would shoot. The days were usually quiet, so the men tried to catch up on sleep while the sentries, which are guards, watched the enemy trenches. Mostly, troops were properly fed, but sometimes food supplies broke down when there was heavy bombardment by the enemy artillery. The men then went hungry. To relieve boredom, soldiers spent around 7 to 10 days in the front line, then moved into the reserve lines, and then moved into the rear area to rest. So there were 3 sections. There was the front line of trenches, there was the reserve line of trenches, and then there was the rest area. Here they were given a bath in the rest area. They were given a bath and clean clothes before returning to the trenches. And oftentimes there would also be lots of explosions in no man's land, so you wouldn't really be able to see some of the stuff that's going on. Obviously, there's going to be men that died in the middle, so a lot of things in the way, and it just was not a very good place. So those area trenches were really the only safety that these soldiers had, where they could be underground but also look up. And so whoever's in those trenches has the advantage, because all they would have to do is just look up and shoot out. Soldiers in the trenches often had to wear masks during fighting to protect them from gas attacks. We'll cover more about gas attacks probably early next week or maybe even tomorrow. But the Germans were the first to use poison gas during the war in 1915. By the middle of the war, it was used a lot by both sides, and all armies had developed fully protective helmets to combat the effects of the chemicals. So not only that, the soldiers are having to look out for gunfire, but they're also having to look out for gas attacks, having to wear those masks and things like that. That is how the Western Front looked. You know, trenches, trench warfare. The The Eastern Front was different. So let's talk about the Eastern Front real quick. Remember the Eastern Front, if I can get my map here again. Can you see that? The Eastern Front is here along the lines of Russia, here into Romania, Austria-Hungary's there, and Germany's right there. So here's the Eastern Front. Let's talk about that briefly. Fighting during World War I did not only take place in the trenches in warfare. On the other side of Europe, a very different war took place between Germany and Austria-Hungary on one side and Russia on the other. There was a lot more movement on the Eastern Front than there was on the Western Front. Here, great armies marched backward and forward across great distances. Both the Austro-Hungarian and Russian armies were badly led and poorly equipped, and both suffered huge losses. In 1915 alone, the Russians lost 2 million men, of whom 1 million were taken prisoner. The German army, led well by General Hindenburg, was much more effective. By the end of 1916, despite some Russian successes, the Germans had the upper hand across the entire Eastern Front. So, as you can see, much different fighting on the Western and Eastern Front. This is going to be something that we're going to learn about as we talk about more about warfare, what was used for fighting in World War I, some of it brand new, and we'll talk probably about that tomorrow. But it is important to know about the Western Front and the Eastern Front. Some of you may be familiar with the book All Quiet on the Western Front. It's a classic book about fighting in World War I. I haven't read it, but I've heard great things about it. That is a good book if you're interested. I'm sure I've heard great things. The book that we will be reading together, and I'm going to try and read the first couple chapters today, is called War Horse. Now, that is a book about Man and His Horse in World War I. It was made into a movie in 2011. From what I've heard, it's a very, very good movie, very, very good book. So we're going to start reading that. Should take us about 2 weeks to get through it. I'm going to read about 2 chapters a day. So look out for that. I'm going to try and have that to you today. But from what I've heard, very good. And we'll continue on that. Thank you, and we'll see you again next group time.